Hello guys, welcome to the Concepts of Medical, and today we have start a series of lecture about the skeleton, and we will make different videos and many videos about the skeletons, anatomy of skeletons. So what is actually skeletons and what are its content and what is it made of? So in this video we will just talk about its and the bone, all body bones, that how many bones do we have in our body. So first we will just define the skeleton, that what is the skeleton. So skeleton is actually the framework of bone, associated ligaments and cartilages and joints. So it is actually the framework of bone associated with ligaments. So how many terms we are discussing here in the skeletons? The first term here we have is to study about the bone. It is actually consist of the bone skeleton, and the second we discuss its ligament associated ligaments, right? And the third term here we have is cartilages, and the fourth we have is the joints. Yeah. So I'll make different videos and separate videos about all these terms, but today this video is actually all about the bone, that how many bones do we have in our body and what are their names and how to memorize it very simply by the fingertips, right? So I assure you that you will never ever forget all names of our body, of our body bones, right? So let's start the video. So skeleton, we actually divide our skeleton into two. This is actually our skeleton, right? So we actually divide the skeleton in two parts, right? So the first part we have is the axial skeleton, right? Axial skeleton, and another is appendicular skeleton, right? All right. So what is actually constitute the axial skeleton? So the axial skeleton is actually so in axial skeleton we have three parts actually. So the first part here we have in the axial skeleton is the skull or head, right? And the second part we have is the chest cavity, right? And the third part we have is the vertebral column. So axial skeleton is actually consist of these three region. Actually this is the skull and chest cavity, and the third one is what? Vertebral column. So within the skull, how many bones do we have? All the calculations and all the numbers of bones we will discuss in the next video, but in this video we are just talking about their names, that how to memorize them all. So first we will talk about the skull or head. So within the skull or head region, we divide it in two part, right? One is cranium and another is facial bone. So first I'll talk about this cranium, and then I'll talk about the facial bone. So what is actually cranium constitute of? So we divide this cranium into two part. One is narrow cranium, right? And another is basocranium, right? So then another, this narrow cranium we divided in two types of bones: paired bones, paired bones of narrow cranium, and this is actually unpaired bone of narrow craniums. So how many bones do we have here in this paired bones? So the first bone here we have in this paired bones of narrow cranium, the first bone here we have is the temporal bone, and the second is actually parietal. So these are actually two in number, right? Two in number, because this is paired bones. Temporal bones are actually present on both sides of our skull, and parietal bones are also present on both sides of our skull, right? So the second here we have is unpaired bones are also two. The first bone here we have is the frontal bone, which is one in number, and the second is occipital bone. I'll make another separate video about all these bone and about mnemonics, that how to memorize all these bones in the fingertips by mnemonics. So I'll make a separate video about that as well, right? But now you just trust me just to memorize and just to learn their names, right? In the basocranium we have also two bones, right? The first bone here we have is the sphenoid, right, and the second bone is ethmoid. So how many bones do we actually discussed here? First is, this is also unpaired bone, right? So these are also unpaired bones. Only the paired bones here we have in the cranium is these two, temporal and parietals. So how many bones do we discuss here? 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So how many bones do we have in the cranium? We have 8 bones in the cranium, right? And the second part of our skull and head region is actually the, I'll talk it here, I'll write it here, is the facial bone. So within the facial bone, we have, facial is actually 14 bones. So we will discuss all of them, that what are their names. So facial bones are also divided into two parts. First is the paired bones of facial, and the second is unpaired bones. So first I'll write their names, that what are these bones. So paired bones are actually 6 in number in the facial, right? So the first bone here we have is the zygomatic, and the second is maxilla. The third bone here we have is the lacrimal. The fourth one bone here we have is the nasal bone, and the fifth one bone here is palatine, and the last one and the sixth one is the inferior nasal concha. So all these bones are actually 2 in number, right? Because these are paired bones of our face, right? So these are actually 2 in number. So the second, we divide them in unpaired bones. So what are the names of these unpaired bone actually, right? So these are actually 2 bones, right? Unpaired bones we have only 2. The first is mandible, which is 1 in number, and the second is woma, which is also 1 in number. So how many bones do we discussed here? First we have discussed here is the 6 bones in the paired. 1 2 3 4 5 6 multiplied by 2 is equal to 6, and 2 these bones, so 6 multiplied by 2 is 12, and 2 bone these, so it becomes how many bones? 14 bones. So we discussed head bones, skull bones, cranium, and facial bones in detail, and what are their names exactly. So the third part here we have is the ear ossicles or ear bone or auditory ossicles, right? So this is actually the third part of our bone. So this is also constitute of two types of bones. This is actually here in each ear we have 3 bones, and collectively we have 6 bones in the ear, and our auditory ossicles bones we have 6, right? So the first bone here we have is the malleus, second is incus, and the third one is stapes. So these are actually 2 in number, right? So how many bones do we study here? In here we study only 3 bones, and each and 2 in each ear. So collectively ear auditory ossicles are actually 6 in number, right? So we just cover the head regions of our the head region of our skeleton, and now we will just go towards the chest cavity. As I told you that axial skeleton is actually consists of skull or head region, chest cavity or vertebral column. So we have just covered the head regions, which is actually divided into cranium, facial, and auditory ossicles, and now we will just move on to the chest cavity, that how many bones do we have in the chest cavity. So the second part we have is the chest cavity, right? So the chest cavity, it is very simple, right? So the first bone here we have is the sternum, and ribs. So sternum is actually 1 in numbers, and ribs we divide into 3 parts, right? The first part of ribs we have true ribs, which is actually connected both posteriorly with the vertebral column and anteriorly with the sternum, so we call it the true ribs. So these are actually 7 in number, right? And actually 7 at one side, so at both sides we have actually will multiply it with 2, right? Another is we have false ribs. And false ribs are which ribs? False ribs are actually those ribs which are connected posteriorly with the vertebral column, but interiorly they are not directly connected with the sternum. Rather, they are connected with the costal cartilage of the true ribs. So these are actually 3 in numbers, and 3 at one side, so at both sides we will multiply it with 2, right? And the third we have is actually floating ribs, right? So these are actually 2 in numbers, and 2 at one side, so we will multiply it with 2. So the floating ribs are actually both ribs which are connected posteriorly with the vertebral columns, but interiorly they are not connected, they are just hanging in the abdominal regions. So these were actually all about the chest cavity. So how many bones do we have here? if we just add them, so we have 12 at one side, we will multiply it with 2, so these become what, 24. So 24 bones we have, and what 24 are actually ribs, and one is sternum. So in chest cavity, how many bones do we have? 25, right? So the third point here we have is the vertebral column. Vertebral column are actually constitute of 5 types of vertebra. So what are their names? So the first vertebra are actually the cervical vertebra. Cervical. So cervical vertebra are actually 7 in number, and the second we have is the thoracic vertebra, which are actually 12 in number, and the third we have is the lumbar vertebrae, which are actually 5 in number, and the fourth one we have is the sacral, which are also 5 in numbers, but actually they are just collect them as one bone, because all these 5 bones are fused together and they make one bone, so we just collect them as one bone. So rather you can collect them, or you can count them as 5 bones or one bone. So that's why we have different numbers of bones. Some in some books we have 217 bones in our body, and some books we have 206 bones in our body. So that's how we just count them from there. So I will just clear all these concepts for you guys, that how we just count bones as 217, and how they are come 206. So these are actually the point to be noted, right? And the five are actually coccygeal vertebra. These are actually 4 in number, but these are also just fused together and make one tailbone. So we just consider them as one bone. So what will be its number? So 7, 12, 5, 5, and 4. If we count them together, so it will become 33. But if we count these two vertebrae as a one, then it comes 26, right? So we will add all these bones together when we are making video about the numbers of bones and how we just count them. So at that video we will just first we will count vertebral column as 33, and in that 33 all the bones of our body will come 217, and when we count them as 26, then all the bones of our body will come 206, right? So the next part we have just covered the appendicular skeletons. In this chart I have told you that skeleton is actually divided in the axial and appendicular skeletons. So we covered the head regions, right? So we have actually covered the head region and also chest cavity. So in head region, how many bones do we have here, right? In head regions we have actually 28 bones, right? Because 8 cranium and 14 facial bone and 4 ossicles bone. So in the head regions we have 28 bone. In chest cavity, how many bones do we have? 25. Here I have told you, right? So in chest cavity we have 25 bone, and vertebral column are actually 33 are 26, right? And one bone is another which is called hyoid bone, which is actually present in our neck region. So we did not study them in this axial skeleton or appendicular skeleton, but we will just make them here. The fourth one is actually hyoid bone. So how many bones it becomes? Plus one hyoid bone. But if we just count them together, so first we will count 33. So then it will come. So if we count the axial skeleton, that how many bones do we have in the axial skeletons? So the first in the skull we have 28 bones. I'll add them in the calculator so that there will be no any doubt. In the chest cavity we have 25, right? And in the vertebral we have 33, and one is hyoid bone, so it becomes 87, right? 87. But if we add the vertebral column as 26, then how much will it come, right? 28, 25 plus 26 plus 1, so then it come 80, right? So axial skeleton, or you can also say that axial skeleton is actually consist of 87 bone, or it is actually consist of 80 bones, right?